In this module and in this video, you will learn about some of the developmental issues pertaining to the studies of development of self-awareness, sense of self. And specifically, we will discuss whether developmental scientists believe it is innate, something we are born with, or something that we develop over time, why some people may develop a negative self-evaluation while others have a positive view of themselves, and whether these different views of oneself have any lasting effects on other aspects of our development, such as development of self-identity, self-esteem, and even your work choices. A sense of self can be defined as, and I quote, awareness and knowledge that you are an independent social entity to which others react and which you attempt to present to the world in ways that reflect favorably of you. It is believed that we are not born with that knowledge, that we exist independently from others. For example, research suggests that very young infants do not have sense of themselves, again, sense of awareness, that they are individuals separate from others right away. And that the roots of self-awareness begin to grow at around the age of 12 months. At least we start to see from in research that there are some signs of self-awareness around 12 months of age. The process of self-awareness can be examined by studying early pre-symbolic signs or precursors of social self-awareness. So those are more implicit perception of yourself as a social agent, also as physical self-awareness, and also as an explicit social self-awareness. Social self-awareness requires first symbolic development and theory of mind, which infants do not have developed yet. But some researchers have asked if newborns can actually perceive themselves on a pre-symbolic level implicitly, and that is that they implicitly have some social awareness. Now, there seems to be some evidence, both for and against it. For example, immediately after birth, infants begin to orient their attention to people and be very sensitive to people's facial emotional expressions and the patterns of infant-directed speech. Infants are able to engage in bidirectional social dialogue with their caregivers through, again, mostly it's through facial matching, synchronizing their facial, and also vocal expressions with others. Some researchers interpret this as evidence that infants have some sense of themselves as social agents to be able to engage on that level. In a highly coordinated and meaningful social interactions with other people, kind of almost mimicking a verbal dialogue with another person. Now, others believe that we can explain infant ability to engage in social interactions with others without ascribing to them being aware of themselves. They believe that this represents infants' innate human ability to emotionally identify with others. For example, people tend to automatically mimic the facial, vocal, and postural expressions of others, which automatically gives them some access to others' emotional state. And this phenomenon is referred to as social contagion. Since this appears to occur automatically, some researchers believe no conscious awareness of oneself and others is required. So it's still more or less a debate. The physical self-agency refers to the perception of one's actions and self-perceptions of one's body. So, for example, you don't have to see your arm to know what it is doing at any given moment. You can perceive where your arm is located. You can feel it, and you're aware that that's your arm. And that's because we have a distinct perception of ourselves as physical agents. Physical self-recognition and perceptions of our body appears to be linked to our brain development. And already at about 2 months, infants show ability to recognize one's physical self from others, so they can distinguish, themselves from others on, physical level. They're very sensitive to the contingent events produced by their own motor activity. So a common paradigm to kind of demonstrate this is to tie infants' leg to a mobile, and then very soon infants learn to associate their leg kicking with movement of the mobile, and they usually increase their leg kicking after that detection. And in fact, contingency between their actions and the produced effect is very enjoyable for infants, and they can you can readily observe that when you see them smiling and cooing in response to that. So that's one of those experimental paradigms that are used to study infant perception of contingency. Psychologists have developed special techniques, so paradigms, to study physical perceptions of our bodies. This question has been particularly important for development of more advanced prosthetic limbs, and that is artificial limbs that would feel like real limbs. So the research, infant research on physical perception can have practical implication. So one of the paradigm is called rubber hand illusion, and you can see the picture on the slide describing the setup of this specific procedure. So in a typical paradigm, subject's real hand, but hidden hand, is stroked, while simultaneously a rubber hand, which is positioned in place of the hidden hand, is also being stroked. The combination of this tactile sensation, visually seeing it, and self-identifying the rubber hand with one's own hand results in perceiving the rubber hand as your own hand. But how would you recreate the same sensation, but without a tactile stimulation of the stump? In one such recent experiment with 2 patients undergoing epilepsy surgery, a slightly different experiment was conducted using this rubber hand paradigm. But this time, the subject's brain area, the part responsible for the hand sensation, perception of hand, in the somatosensory cortex, was stimulated at the same time as the artificial limb was also stroked. So the picture of this experiment is shown on the slide. And so the subject was able to see the artificial limb as the brain was being stimulated by delivering an electric current. So the brain was stimulated with electrical current. And as the result, the subject did experience the feeling that the limb belonged to them, actually. So they've essentially recreated that perception of that is my real limb. Now, in terms of our social self-awareness, understanding that that understanding entails understanding that we have goals, intentions, feelings, and they're different from the goals, intentions, potentially, and feelings of other people. And so more kind of explicit signs of that rudimentary understanding begins to emerge somewhere between 9 and 12, during which time infants begin to perceive others and their own actions as specifically goal-directed and intentional. So ability to interpret others' goals as goal-directed behavior allows infants to engage in a joint attention and goal-directed activity with others. So researchers like, for example, Tomasello, believe that interpreting others' behavior as intentional is an important milestone in the development of the self, as it means that infants recognize that they are a social intentional agent themselves, and that that kind of also imputes the same qualities into others as well. So recognizing that I'm an intentional and goal-directed agent also translates to thinking that and perceiving others as the same way. Now, the development of an explicit self-awareness emerges somewhere between 12 and 18 months. Psychologists also call this kinds of development or self-awareness as categorical or objective sense of self. Essentially, it's the sense of self, or in thinking of yourself as a person with mental states, in the specific paradigm, experimental paradigm that was designed to specifically assess that development in the young infants is called mirror rouge paradigm. So basically the way it works, a spot of rouge is applied to a child's nose, and then the child is given a mirror to look at their own reflection, self-image. A child who has developed that sense of self, that explicit understanding of oneself as a separate agent, social agent with mental states, if the child that has developed that sense, he or she should touch his or her nose after seeing that reflection of themselves with the rouge on their nose, and try, for example, wipe it. A child who has not developed a sense of self should touch, for example, the reflected image of the nose in the mirror. This explicit self-awareness is typically accompanied by the development of secondary emotions like feeling pride, guilt, or shame. It is believed that the child must hold that mental representation of oneself to be able to feel those kinds of emotion, to be able to feel guilt or pride for their own actions. It is also associated with empathy. So children who have developed, who can develop self-awareness and can feel guilt or pride, more likely to experience empathy for others. They also develop verbal and symbolic communication. Children, for example, who pass the mirror test show high level of empathy, verbal and symbolic development. So those kinds of milestones or developmental milestones co-occur. Although having a self-concept is a universal characteristic, so perceiving yourself as a self, being self-aware is a universal characteristic for all humans. Studies have shown that parenting can play a role in at least the timing of the when that occurs. For example, more contingent responsiveness to infant signals. For example, cooing, smiling, face-to-face, regular face-to-face communication contributes to earlier self-recognition, as tested by the mirror test. Because it is believed that it promotes sense of differentiation of oneself from others through the detection of consequences to one's own actions. For example, the child may feel that my smiling leads to my caregiver smiling, or my crying can cause others to act, which means that I am different from others, that I am capable of influencing the event's consequences. It can influence the environment and other people. Differences in cultural practice can also influence not only, as we know, parenting behavior, but also the timing of the development of self-awareness. For example, parents of collectivistic cultures that value interdependence tend to show actually less face-to-face interactions with infants, but more of a body contact and body stimulation kind of interactions. And this difference is potentially can contribute to development of later development of self-awareness. Again, as tested by the mirror test. This was at least found in the studies of German and Cameroon mothers and toddlers, looking at comparing the time, the differences in the time or differences between the development of self-awareness in children of German and Cameroon toddlers. So according to research studying, for example, children in Kenya, children also in at least one study actually failed to pass the mirror test, even when children were 6 years of age. But that actually raised more questions about whether the mirror test is culturally appropriate to use to test children of a different culture. For example, children, those children who failed to pass the merit test at 6 years of age did show that they were healthy and well-functioning children. So there were no other issues, cognitive or social issues. So again, this raised the question whether the kids truly actually, whether they actually are not self-aware, or maybe perhaps the test seems was not showing that the effect. So one of the researchers believed that the behavior that these kids were displaying, and they were actually displaying freezing-like behavior, and they believe that those were signs actually of self-recognition in the mirror. Their behavior essentially is a reaction to the that rouge on their face was simply different from the behavior of a typical Western child. But nevertheless, it should be considered as passing that test. So again, the issue is sometimes not so much when we do find perhaps cultural differences, sometimes you need to ask whether the measures, the assessments that are used to measure cultural differences are applicable in non-Western cultures, for example. So the quote that I'm quoting, one of the scientists who says, currently mirror mark tests are the best known, most accepted method, but the absence of an effect does not necessarily mean that the absence of the thing we're trying to measure. So we always have to be aware of the fact that sometimes maybe the measures that are used in the studies may not be always appropriate. And similar issue has been noted when studying self-awareness in animals, which has been done. So again, the researchers have said that the physical abilities of the animals and the way they interact with the environment must be taken into consideration when we apply certain procedures or testing them in certain ways. So I want to give you a little bit of more recent study using testing dogs on self-awareness, bodily self-awareness. In the study, the bodily self-awareness was defined as the ability to hold information about one's own body in mind as an explicit object in relation to other objects in the world. And so again, the goal of the study was to test whether dogs can actually show bodily self-awareness applying a different paradigm. So the researchers chose to use what is called own body as an obstacle paradigm, which is a paradigm that was used studying toddlers. And it's basically when your body is an obstacle to execute a task. And so that's the paradigm has been used with little children. Toddlers, specifically, were requested to hand over a blanket that they were sitting on, and infants younger than 18 and 24 months did not move off from the blanket and eventually gave up trying to finish the task, which means that they did not pass the test of bodily self-awareness. So that's how you would determine whether you pass or do not pass the test. So here's the picture representing this kind of similar paradigm, but with dogs in the study, by Lange and colleagues, 2021. So the experiment had several actual conditions, and the one where the experimental condition was when the object that the dog had to pick up was attached to the mat on which the dog was sitting. And so to pass the test, the dog would need to leave the mat, would recognize that your body is actually keeping you from picking up the object. The control condition was when the mat was attached to the ground. And so the dog would have to, again, perceive correctly that the mat is being held not by their own body, by the ground. And so in this condition, you don't need to get up to leave the mat to be able to pick up the object. So to support that the dogs are actually bodily self-aware, the result should be that more dogs would have to leave the mat in the experimental condition, which is the condition where the mat that they are the dog is attached to the mat, right, sitting on the mat. And so you can see on figure to the right, figure 1 is actually the figure taken from the article displaying the results, the differences between the two conditions. And as you could see that the dark blue represents the percentage of dogs that actually left the mat in the condition, in the experimental condition, which is the condition attached to the mat. And so it does suggest that dogs show at least bodily self-awareness.